The bell for Compline had not yet rung, though the light was already going out of the small infirmary window, when the sisters gathered close around the bed to watch her die. It was the evening of September 30th, 1897, a Thursday, and the nun they had come to see was 24 years old. She weighed by then almost nothing. Her lungs had been failing her for a year and a half, filling with the slow drowning of tuberculosis. And for weeks she had told her sisters, quite plainly, that she would not see another October. Now the hour had come, and she looked, one of them would later say, not like a woman being defeated, but like a woman being received. She had asked, some days before, that they not leave her alone at the end. Mother Agnes of Jesus, her own sister Pauline, who had once been a second mother to her in the house on the Rue Saint-Blaise, and who was now her prioress, knelt near enough to catch what breath was left in her. Around the bed stood the small community of Carmel, Marie of the Sacred Heart and Céline, both her blood sisters as well as her sisters in religion, and others of the 20-some Carmelites of Lisieux who had lived beside her for years, without, most of them, suspecting what she carried. She had entered this cloister at 15. She had professed her vows here, sung the office here, scrubbed the refectory floor here, endured the ordinary frictions of common life here, the sister whose habit brushed hers too coldly, the elderly nun whose water splashed her at the wash-basin, and whom she resolved to love instead of resent. Nothing about her 9 years in Carmel had been remarkable to look at. She had asked, in fact, that nothing be remarkable to look at. And yet here, at the very last, something in the room had begun to shine. Witnesses who were present, and their testimony was gathered soon after, while the memory was still warm, for the process that would one day call her a saint of the Universal Church, agree on this much, that in the final moments she looked for an instant at her crucifix, held loosely now in hands too weak to grip it, and that her face changed. Not with fear, whatever had frightened her, and much had in those last black months, seems to have gone quiet in that instant. What crossed her face instead, the sister said, was something closer to astonishment, the astonishment of a soul seeing, for the first time without a veil between, the love it had spent its whole hidden life pursuing. And then she spoke. The words are recorded in more than one testimony from that room, agreeing in substance if not syllable for syllable, and they were not a cry of anguish but of surrender, almost of gratitude. Oh, I love him, my God, I love you. Then she was gone, 24 years old. A cloistered nun of a small provincial Carmel in Normandy, known to almost no one beyond its enclosure walls. Dead of a disease that had been eating her alive since Good Friday of the year before, so quietly that when the doctor examined her lungs late in her illness, he was astonished she had gone on walking about the cloister at all. By every worldly measure this was an obscure death. No crowds waited outside the convent gate. No newspaper in Paris or Rome took note that a young nun named Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin had breathed her last in a modest infirmary bed in Lisieux. She had published nothing in her lifetime. She had founded nothing, reformed nothing, been sent nowhere as a missionary, worked no publicly attested miracle while she lived. If the world had been asked, on October 1st, 1897, to name the notable figures of that turning century, it would not have occurred to a single soul to say her name. And yet, before we go further, before we walk back through her childhood in Alençon, her father's garden, the illness that seized her as a girl of 10, and the Christmas grace that freed her at 14, her audacious plea to a pope for early entrance into Carmel, the long grinding faithfulness of convent life, the terrible darkness that closed over her soul in her final 18 months, even as her body was closing too. Before any of that, I want you to sit with me a moment longer in that infirmary room, because everything this book will tell you afterward is really just an unfolding of what was already whole in that moment. She had spent the last years of her short life promising, quite deliberately, that death would not be an ending for her, but a beginning of a different kind of work. I will spend my heaven doing good on earth, she had told her sisters, not as a poetic flourish, but as a plan, stated as plainly as she stated most things, in the same voice she used to describe the linen closet or the convent garden. She meant to keep loving from the other side of the grave, and to keep loving in a manner suited to who she had always been, not with thunder, but with roses. She spoke, in those last weeks, of letting fall a shower of roses after her death, of spending eternity doing small good for people she would never meet, the way she had spent her convent years doing small good for sisters who barely noticed her doing it. It is one of the most tender promises any saint has left the Church, and history, if we can call what follows mere history, has been catching those roses ever since. Because the strange thing, the thing that makes her death worth opening this whole book with, rather than saving for its final page, is that it did not stay obscure. Something happened after September 30th, 1897 that has no ordinary explanation, unless you are willing to entertain the possibility that a Carmelite nun's last promise was kept. Within a very few years of her death, a modest little book, the compiled manuscript she had written under her prioress's obedience, edited by her sister Pauline and published under the title Story of a Soul, began making its way beyond the convent walls, first to other Carmels in France, then to the parish churches of Normandy, then further into Italy, into England, across the ocean to the Americas. It did not travel the way books usually travel, driven by clever marketing or the reputation of an already famous author. It traveled the way rumor travels, or the way fragrance travels, person to person. A copy passed from a nun to a cousin, to a parish priest, to a soldier going off to the trenches of the First World War, with her pages folded in his coat pocket. Soldiers in that terrible war would write home, describing how they had found comfort in the words of a young French nun, most of them had never heard of before the fighting began, a nun who had died, not on any battlefield, but quietly, of consumption, in a convent bed. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, her name was known across a continent that had buried millions of its sons, and thousands of those grieving families found in her small book something that answered the enormity of their loss with an answer of astonishing smallness, that God could be trusted with a child's whole trust, that no act of love, however hidden, however small, is ever wasted. By 1925, not even 30 years after that quiet death in Lisieux, the Church did what it does only after the most exacting scrutiny. It canonized her. Pope Pius XI raised Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin to the altars of the Universal Church as Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face, and he did so remarkably, waiving the usual 50-year waiting period, because the devotion of the faithful had simply outrun the Church's own timetable. People were not waiting for permission to love her, they already did. 2 years later, he named her, alongside St. Francis Xavier, co-patron of all the missions of the world, an extraordinary designation for a woman who had never once left her enclosure, who had begged all her short religious life to be sent to the Carmel of Hanoi and been refused the chance by her failing lungs. She had wanted so badly to be a missionary in the ordinary sense, to cross oceans and preach in foreign tongues, and instead she was given something stranger, patronage over every mission field on earth, won not by travel, but by what she called her hidden way of love, offered from inside 4 walls in Normandy. And in 1997, precisely 100 years, to the calendar from that evening in the infirmary, Pope John Paul II named her a Doctor of the Church. It is one of the rarest honors the Church can bestow, reserved across 2,000 years of Christian history for a small number of souls whose writing has been judged to carry not merely personal holiness, but a teaching authority for the whole body of Christ. Augustine, Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross. Into that company entered a young woman who had never studied theology in any school, who left behind no treatise, no systematic work, only a handful of manuscripts written at her superior's request, some of it scribbled by candlelight in the evenings after a day of ordinary convent labor, unfinished at points because death overtook the hand that was writing it. She is the youngest doctor of the Church in the whole history of that honor. She died at 24, having written what she wrote almost entirely in the last decade of a life bounded by a provincial Carmel, most of her contemporaries in Lisieux, would have struggled to locate on a map, and the Church has now told the entire world, formally and without qualification, that we should sit at her feet and learn. What did she teach that was worth 100 years of roses falling before the world took proper notice? This whole book is an answer to that question, and I do not want to rush it, because a life like hers does not yield its gift to a summary. But I can tell you, standing here at the foot of her deathbed, before we go back to the beginning, what the heart of it is, because she told us herself plainly more than once. She called it her little way, la petite voie, and she meant by it something almost scandalously simple, that the path to sanctity is not a ladder of great deeds climbed by the spiritually strong, but a lift, an elevator, into which the spiritually small can simply climb and be carried upward by love itself. She wrote once that she had searched the scriptures for a way to become holy that did not require heroic virtues she knew herself to lack, and had found her answer in the words of the book of Proverbs, where wisdom says, "Whoever is a little one, let him come to me." She understood herself, without a trace of false modesty, to be a little one, not gifted with visions like some of the great mystics before her, not called to found new religious orders or reform old ones. Not even in her own telling, especially virtuous by nature, she confessed to real faults, a childhood temper, a tendency to tears, an oversensitivity that cost her and others around her. What she had instead was trust, offered without reservation, and she came to believe and to teach with the confidence of someone who had tested it in the crucible of her own weakness, that trust of that kind was the whole of the way. She called herself the little flower, not out of false humility, but because she understood the metaphor exactly, that the garden needs not only the great roses, admired from a distance, but also the small wildflowers, the violets and daisies that most passers-by never notice at all, whose fragrance nonetheless rises, unseen, and pleases the gardener just the same. She believed, she said so directly, that God's love does not measure a soul by the grandeur of its deeds, but by the love folded into whatever small deed is at hand. Picking up a pin from the floor for love, she once said, could save a soul. She meant it, she lived by it. And she died proving that a life built entirely on such small acts, offered with total trust, could shine so brightly after death that it would draw 100 years of pilgrims to a convent gate in Normandy, and would earn from Rome itself the rarest theological honor the Church possesses. I tell you all this now, at the very start, because I do not want you to mistake the story that follows for a merely charming one, a sweet tale of a nun who liked flowers and died young. It is that, in part, there is real sweetness in her, real tenderness, and I hope this book lets you feel it. But sitting in that infirmary room on the evening of September 30th, 1897, watching the sisters gather close, watching her lift her eyes to the crucifix and speak her last words of love, you are watching something the Church itself has since certified as one of the great spiritual events of the modern age. The smallness was not incidental to the sanctity, it was the very shape of it. She discovered, and this is the discovery this whole book exists to walk you through, slowly, chapter by chapter, the way you might walk beside a friend telling you the story of someone she loves, that holiness is not, finally, a matter of scale. It is a matter of love. And love, she showed us, can be carried in a life so small, so hidden, so apparently unremarkable, that the world does not even notice it happening, right up until the moment the soul who lived it steps into eternity, and the fragrance that was always there, quietly, becomes suddenly, undeniably, everywhere. She had told her sisters in the weeks before she died not to be afraid to speak of her after her death, not to bury her memory the way the Carmelite custom sometimes buried its dead, in silence and a name unremembered outside the cloister walls. "I will spend my heaven doing good on earth," she said. And she meant, I think, exactly what a gardener means when she promises that even from beneath the soil, in the dark, something is going to grow. It has grown. That much we already know, standing here at the end, before we have even properly begun. What we do not yet know, what the rest of this book wants to show you tenderly and I hope truthfully, is how a shy, sensitive, motherless girl from provincial Normandy became the small burning root of it all. For that we have to go back. We have to go back nearly 25 years, to a house in Alençon, to a lace-maker's daughter, and to a father who used to call her his little queen. On the 4th of January, 1873, 2 days after her birth, a baby girl was carried through the cold streets of Alençon to the church of Notre Dame. The morning was sharp with frost, and the infant wrapped against it was so frail that her parents feared for her. They did not wait for a milder day. They wanted her named and washed clean and claimed by God before anything else could happen to her. The priest poured the water and spoke the name they had chosen, Marie-Françoise Thérèse. It was not a name picked out of a book of saints at random, nor merely a family favorite passed down without thought. 3 years earlier, Zélie Martin had given that same name, Thérèse, to another daughter, a little girl who lived only a few months before God took her home. Zélie never spoke of that loss as something to bury and forget. She carried it the way mothers do, folded into the quiet of her days. And when this new baby came, small, red, gasping at first, so weak the midwife despaired of her, Zélie gave her the name again. Not to erase the first Thérèse, but to keep her, to say, this name belongs to our family still. This hope is not finished with us yet. If you want to understand anything about the child who would one day be called the little flower of Jesus, start there, with a mother's stubborn, tender refusal to let a name and a love go unfulfilled. To understand Thérèse at all, you have to walk backward first, into the lives of Louis and Zélie Martin, because nothing about this saint makes sense apart from the house she was born into. Louis Martin was a watchmaker, a careful man who had once wanted something else entirely. As a young man, he had walked all the way to the great St. Bernard Hospice in the Alps, hoping the Augustinian canons there would take him in as a novice. They turned him away. His Latin was not equal to it, and he came home to Alençon and took up his father's trade instead, keeping shop on the Rue de Pont-Neuf, bent over the small gears and springs of other people's clocks. He was quiet, methodical, a man who loved long solitary walks and the Blessed Sacrament, and fishing in the early morning mist along the river Sarthe. For years he lived almost as a hermit in the middle of a busy town, intending never to marry at all. Zélie Guérin had wanted the convent too, the Daughters of Charity specifically, whose blue-grey habits and hospital wards she had admired since girlhood. The sister who interviewed her said plainly that this was not her vocation. Zélie went home in tears, and, not long after, prayed for a sign of what she was meant to do instead. She had no gift for lacework by nature, only by will. She taught herself the astonishingly fine and difficult point d'Alençon stitch, until she could not only make it but design it, and eventually she built a small business selling it, employing other women, keeping her own books, corresponding with buyers as far away as Paris. She was quick, warm, anxious, devout, and, by her own frequent admission in her letters, inclined to worry herself sick over the people she loved, which, as it turned out, would be a great many people. Louis and Zélie met, the story goes, on a bridge in Alençon, and something in each of them recognized the other's seriousness of purpose. They married within 3 months, in 1858, at midnight, in the church of Notre Dame, the same church where their youngest daughter would be baptized 15 years later. And here is a detail worth sitting with, because it tells you something essential about the household Thérèse was born into. For the first months of their marriage, Louis and Zélie tried to live as brother and sister, believing that a marriage lived in continence, without children, might be its own form of consecration. The confessor persuaded them otherwise, that God was calling them to raise up children for heaven, not to imitate the cloister inside their own home. They accepted this correction with the same obedience they brought to everything else, and from then on gave themselves to family life the way other souls give themselves to religious vows, completely and with their eyes fixed past this world toward the next. 9 children were born to Louis and Zélie Martin. 4 of them did not live to grow up. 2 little boys died in infancy. A daughter named Helen died at not quite 5 years old, after which Zélie wrote to her brother that she had wept until she thought her heart would break, and then had gone on, because there was still a house to run and children still living who needed her. Another infant, that first Marie Mélanie Thérèse, lived only a few weeks. This is the ground Thérèse was born into, not a storybook nursery of unbroken happiness, but a real household where grief and faith stood side by side at the same table, where a mother could bury 4 of her children and still, each time, choose to trust God with the next one. 5 daughters lived, Marie, born in 1860, Pauline in 1861, Léonie in 1863, Céline in 1869, and then 10 years after Marie and 13 years into the marriage, the last child arrived, small, sickly at first, nearly given up for lost in her first weeks, Marie-Françoise Thérèse, whom the family would simply call Thérèse. Zélie's letters from those years, and she wrote constantly to her brother Isidore and his wife, to friends, letters that survive by the hundreds, are full of this last baby with a mixture of delight and worry that any parent of a strong-willed late child will recognize instantly. She describes a little girl of enormous tenderness and equally enormous temper, quick to tears, quick to affection, quick to a kind of fierce and total love that frightened her mother a little, even as it charmed her. Zélie worried over her intensity. She worried that a child so sensitive, who could be undone by the smallest correction or the mildest scolding, might not survive contact with the world's ordinary roughness. She was, in a sense, already glimpsing something true, that this particular child had been given a heart with no half measures in it, a heart that would either be broken by life or transfigured by grace, with very little middle ground available. It is tempting, reading those letters now, to smile at the picture of the toddling Thérèse throwing herself into the arms of whoever loved her best, weeping bitterly at real or imagined slights, and then, minutes later, glowing with an affection so open it left nothing back. But there is something else in that picture too, something Zélie herself may not have fully understood she was watching, the earliest, roughest sketch of the soul, who would one day write that her way to God was not through great deeds, but through very small ones, offered with everything she had. The oversensitive little girl and the saint who would teach the whole church how to love in littleness are the same person. Nothing was wasted in her, not even the tears. She was not quite 4.5 years old when everything changed. Zélie had for some years carried a growing pain in her breast, which she tried at first to ignore, the way a woman running a household and a business and raising 5 daughters will often ignore her own body until it can no longer be ignored. By the time doctors examined her properly, the cancer was advanced. She traveled to Lourdes in the summer of 1877, praying at the grotto for a cure, bringing her daughter's prayers with her, along with her own. No cure came. She returned home knowing, with the plain clarity she brought to everything, that she was dying, and she spent her last weeks setting her affairs and her family in order with the same brisk competence she had once brought to her lace ledgers. Thérèse was in the room, or nearby, through much of it, a small child moving at the edges of an adult grief too large for her to fully take in, catching fragments of what was happening the way children do, in glimpses and half-understood silences. She would later write of standing in a hallway of the house and hearing herself described, by someone kind enough to be honest, as motherless now, and of the strange cold feeling that word gave her, as though she had been handed a fact too big to carry, and could only set it down somewhere inside herself and walk on. Zélie Martin died on the 28th of August, 1877. Thérèse was 4 years old. There is no soft way to say what that loss did to her, and I will not pretend otherwise. She herself, years later, in the pages of Story of a Soul, described her whole character changing after her mother's death, the once radiant, high-spirited little girl becoming timid, easily overcome by tears, painfully shy in the presence of strangers, needing to be coaxed and reassured at every turn. Something in her had closed like a door in a draught. She would spend the rest of her childhood, by her own account, in a kind of shadow, not because anyone failed to love her, but because the one love a small child cannot do without had been taken from her at the age when a child needs it most. And yet, this is the part that matters, the part that keeps this from being only a story of wounding, the family did not let her fall through the cracks of that grief. Louise Martin, now a widower with 5 daughters, the youngest not yet 5 years old, made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He moved the family from Alençon to Lisieux to be near Zélie's brother Isidore Guérin, an apothecary there, so that his daughters would not grow up far from family who could help raise them. He rented a house on a hill above the town, with a walled garden and a view over the rooftops toward the Norman countryside, and he called it, as the family always would, Les Buissonnets, the little bushes, or the thicket. It was there, at Les Buissonnets, that the wounded child slowly began to heal into the woman she would become. Marie and Pauline, the 2 eldest sisters, stepped into something of their mother's place, mothering the younger ones with real tenderness, even as they themselves were barely more than girls. Céline, only 4 years older than Thérèse, became her closest companion, the 2 of them inseparable through long afternoons in the garden, building little altars out of stones and wildflowers, making toy sacrifices for love of Jesus the way other children play at keeping shop. And Louis, quiet, devout, gentle Louis, who had once wanted to be a monk, became, in the most literal sense, both father and mother to his youngest daughter. He called her his little queen. He took her fishing along the river banks the way he once had gone, alone, only now with a small girl trotting at his side, asking him about the birds and the sky and God. He let her come with him to early mass, let her sit with him in the evenings while he read, answered her questions about heaven, with the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for something and had decided this child was worth all of that waiting. The garden at Les Buissonnets is not a small detail in this story. It is where Thérèse's heart, bruised, oversensitive, quick to weep and quick to love, was given room and quiet and years enough to mend. She built little shrines there among the flowers. She played at being a hermit, at being a martyr, at every form of holy make-believe a devout French child of the 1870s could imagine. And underneath the play, something real was taking shape. A habit of turning every small thing, every stone gathered, and every flower picked, toward God. She was still, by her own later admission, a difficult and tearful little girl through much of this time, prone to what her family gently called her sensitiveness, undone by the smallest reproach, needing far more reassurance than a child ought reasonably to need. Her sisters would spend hours coaxing her out of tears that a single unkind word could bring on in an instant. But love met her there, patiently, every day, in that garden and that house, a father's steady tenderness, a sister's mothering, the ordinary rhythms of a devout household saying its prayers together each night. And slowly, without anyone quite marking the day it happened, the wound her mother's death had opened began, not to close over and disappear, but to become something else, a soil. Everything Thérèse would one day teach the world about trust, about smallness, about throwing herself without reserve into the arms of a father who would not let her fall, all of it was planted first in that walled garden above Lisieux, watered by grief and by love in nearly equal measure, waiting, as gardens do, for the season when it would finally break the surface and bloom. She would cry, she tells us, over almost nothing, a word spoken too quickly at the dinner table, a game that ended before she wanted it to, a bouquet of cornflowers left too long in the sun and wilted before she could give it away. Any of these could open the floodgates. Thérèse herself, years later, looking back at this stretch of her childhood, with the plain honesty that marks every page of Story of a Soul, called it a sickness almost as real as any fever. She was, she admits, unbearably sensitive. She wept when she cried, and then wept again because she had wept, ashamed of the very tears she could not stop. Anyone who has loved a child through those in-between years, too old for a mother's lap, too young to master a feeling before it masters her, will recognize the portrait she draws of herself between the ages of 10 and 13, a girl brimming, always brimming, with more feeling than her small frame seemed built to hold. Some of that brimming had an obvious source. In October of 1882, when Thérèse was 9, her sister Pauline, the second mother, who had taken up the whole burden of mothering her after Zélie's death, walked through the enclosure door of the Carmelite of Lisieux and did not come home. Thérèse had believed, in the unguarded way children believe things, that when she was grown, she and Pauline would live as hermits together, side by side, forever. Instead, she watched the woman who had taught her her letters and heard her first confidences of the heart disappear behind a grill. She would later write that the day she understood Pauline was gone for good, something in her broke that had not yet had the chance to mend before it broke again. In 1886, her eldest sister Marie, steady, sensible Marie, who had stepped into the mothering role Pauline left vacant, followed Pauline through that same door into that same Carmel. Twice in 4 years, Thérèse watched a mother figure vanish into the cloister. It is little wonder that by the autumn of her 14th year she had begun to fix her whole heart, quietly and with a stubbornness her family had not yet learned to take seriously, on following them there herself. But before that fixed desire could take hold of her, something had to happen to the tears. And it did, on a single night, in a manner so sudden and so complete that Thérèse would spend the rest of her life calling it simply my conversion. Not a conversion from unbelief, for she had never doubted, but a conversion from a kind of prison she had built for herself out of her own oversensitivity. It happened at Christmas, in 1886. The Martin household still kept an old Norman custom. On Christmas Eve, after midnight mass, children left their shoes by the hair to be filled with small gifts overnight, a last flicker of the delighted credulity of early childhood. Thérèse, 13 and already self-conscious about how babyish the tradition had become for a girl her age, nevertheless loved it still, loved it perhaps too much, the way we love the last thing that still lets us be small. That night the family came home from Mass tired. Louis Martin climbing the stairs ahead of his daughter, not knowing she was close enough behind to hear, said to Céline in a voice worn thin with the late hour that this would have to be the last year of it, Thérèse was really getting too old for shoes filled with sweets. He meant nothing cruel by it. It was the ordinary complaint of a tired father near midnight. But the old Thérèse, the Thérèse of 1,000 small wounds nursed into tears, would have gone straight to her room and cried over those words for the rest of the night, and everyone would have gathered around to console her, and the evening would have ended, as so many evenings had ended, in a fuss made over her fragile feelings. She felt the tears rising exactly on schedule. And then, in the space of a few seconds on that staircase, she made a choice she herself could never fully explain except by calling it grace. She forced the tears back down. She went downstairs, took her shoes to the hearth, and opened her gifts in front of her father with such visible, unforced delight that Louis Martin, watching her laugh, laughed with her, and the whole family passed an evening of ordinary Christmas gladness, with no scene, no tears, no fuss at all. It sounds, told plainly, like a small thing, a girl deciding for once not to cry. Thérèse did not experience it as small. She wrote that in that one instant Jesus, who had taken the whole task of that night upon himself, accomplished in a moment what she herself had not managed in 10 years of trying. Charity, she said, entered her heart along with a forgetfulness of self she had never known before. And from that Christmas night onward, she was, in her own word, happy, genuinely, durably happy, no longer a prisoner of her own oversensitivity. She describes feeling, from that night forward, a new strength for the practice of virtue, as though she had grown, she says, in the space of a single evening, the way a giant grows, all at once and permanently. Whatever we choose to call what happened on that staircase, the maturing of a temperament, an ordinary developmental threshold, crossed a little dramatically, or, as Thérèse insists, and as the whole of her later life bears out, a direct and sovereign act of grace. Something in her did change that night and did not change back. The tears did not vanish from her life, but the tyranny of them did. It is worth pausing here, because everything that follows in this chapter depends on it. A girl still weeping over cornflowers does not walk into a bishop's study and ask, with perfect composure, to be allowed into a convent 3 years before the law of the church permits it. A girl still needing to be coaxed out of her feelings every evening does not, months later, kneel before the reigning pope and refuse to be silent when a papal official has told her plainly to hold her tongue. The Christmas grace of 1886 did not give Thérèse her vocation. It gave her the strength to pursue the vocation she already had. That strength found its first great test almost immediately in a scene Thérèse herself set down with such tenderness that it has become, for generations of readers, one of the most beloved moments in the whole of Story of a Soul. It was the spring of 1887, Pentecost Sunday, and 14-year-old Thérèse had decided the time had come to ask her father's permission to enter Carmel, not at the ordinary age, but now as soon as she could be received. She found him sitting in the garden at Les Buissonnets in the late afternoon light, and when she told him what she wanted, this widower, who had already surrendered 2 daughters to the same cloister, did not argue with her, did not tell her she was too young to know her own mind. He wept briefly, and then he walked with her to a low wall nearby and stooped down and picked very gently a small white flower growing there, pulling it up whole, roots and all, unbroken, and held it out to her. He told her that God had preserved this little flower and brought it safely to that day, the same way he had carried her, whole and unbroken, through every year of her life to this moment. Thérèse kept that flower pressed inside her copy of the Imitation of Christ for the rest of her days. It is not too much to say that the very name she would later choose for herself, the Little Flower, has its first quiet root in her own father's hands, on that Pentecost afternoon in that garden. Louise Martin's blessing, given so freely, was the easiest permission Thérèse would obtain. The family council was harder. Her uncle Isidore Guérin, a man of great affection for his nieces, but also of great practical caution, needed time and prayer before he could support sending a 14-year-old into the strict enclosure of Carmel. The Carmel's own ecclesiastical superior, Canon de la Traite, was harder still. He held, not unreasonably by the ordinary standards of the day, that 15 was young enough for such a step, and 14 far too young, and he made his reluctance known in terms that left Thérèse in tears of a different kind than the childhood kind, tears of frustrated longing rather than wounded feeling. And hardest of all was the Bishop of Bayeux, Monseigneur Hugonan, whose permission was required before any exception could even be considered. Thérèse and her father travelled to Bayeux at the end of October 1887 to plead her case in person. The bishop received them kindly, was visibly moved by the sight of this small earnest girl in her long braided hair, arguing her own vocation with such calm certainty, and told her, gently but firmly, that she must wait for his decision. It was in the middle of this uncertain waiting that an opportunity arose which Thérèse, with the boldness the Christmas grace had given her, decided to seize with both hands. That November, a diocesan pilgrimage was being organized to Rome in honor of Pope Leo XIII's Golden Sacerdotal Jubilee, 50 years since his ordination to the priesthood. Louise Martin planned to go, taking Céline with him. Thérèse, hearing of it, resolved on the spot that she would go too, and that while she was in Rome, in the presence of the Holy Father himself, she would ask him directly for the very thing the bishop was still deliberating. It was an audacious plan for a 14-year-old, audacious enough that the pilgrimage's ecclesiastical leaders, learning of her intention, instructed the pilgrims beforehand, in the clearest possible terms, that no one was to address the Pope directly during the audience. A bow, a kiss of his ring, and silence, nothing more. The rest travelled the length of Italy, with that instruction weighing on her like a stone she meant to set down the moment she could. She has left us, in her own writing, a portrait of Rome itself, the shock of seeing the Colosseum, where the early martyrs died, standing in the very dust where they had been thrown to the beasts, for the faith she carried so lightly, and they had carried at the cost of everything. But the whole pilgrimage for her bent toward a single morning, November 20th, 1887, when the pilgrims filed one by one into the Pope's presence in the Vatican. She had promised the Vicar General she would obey the instruction to keep silent. Watching pilgrim after pilgrim kneel, kiss the ring, and move on without a word, feeling her own turn approaching, she found she could not keep that promise. When she knelt before Leo XIII, she has recorded, she looked up and said to him, with tears already starting, that in honor of his jubilee she begged his permission to enter Carmel at 15. The old pope, startled, looked to the priest beside him for an explanation. The vicar general answered that the matter was already before the superiors, who would decide it in due course. Leo XIII turned back to the kneeling girl and told her, kindly but without commitment, that she must do what the superiors decided. Thérèse, unwilling to be turned aside so gently, still knelt there, her hands now clasped on his own knees, repeating her plea, if he wished it, she said. The door of the enclosure at Carmel does not slam, it closes softly, on a well-oiled hinge, the way a door closes on an ordinary evening in an ordinary house. That was perhaps the first surprise waiting for Thérèse on the morning of April 9, 1888. She had imagined, in the long months of pleading for early entrance, that some visible threshold would mark the passage from the world into the cloister, a trumpet note, a change in the very air. Instead, there was a small procession through the enclosure door of the Carmel of Lisieux, a chapel full of family weeping quietly into handkerchiefs, and then the grill, and then silence. She was 15 years old, and she had gotten exactly what she wanted, and now she would have to live inside it. What she found there, in the weeks that followed, was not what she had pictured from the visiting parlor, where she had watched her sisters Pauline and Marie through the black grating and imagined a life of uninterrupted sweetness. Thérèse would later admit, with the same candor that makes every page of Story of a Soul feel like a hand placed on the reader's own, that Carmel disappointed her before it transformed her. She found small miseries where she had expected sanctity in bloom. She found nuns who were tired, or short-tempered, or simply human, going about their prayers and their mending with the same imperfections she had left behind at La Buissonnaise. She found herself, too, vain in small ways she hadn't noticed until the silence gave her nothing else to look at. The ecstasies she had half expected did not come. What came instead was a bell. The bell governed everything. It woke the community at 4:30 for the night office. It summoned them to Mass, to manual labor, to the recitation of the little hours, to the single frugal meal that in Lent shrank to almost nothing. It called them to the great silence after Compline, a silence so total that a dropped thimble could sound like a small catastrophe in the refectory. Carmelite poverty was not a metaphor inside those walls. It was a coarse woolen habit, a straw mattress, a cell furnished with a crucifix, a skull for meditation on death, and nothing else. Thérèse, who had grown up petted and adored, who had been the household's spoiled queen, now earned almost nothing and asked permission for almost everything, a needle, a sheet of paper, a moment to speak. This was the discipline she had begged, on her knees before a pope, to be allowed to enter early. She got it in full, and she did not flinch from it, though it cost her more than the romance of her childhood dream had let her imagine. It was inside this discipline that she met, in full force, the woman who would be both her greatest human trial in religion and one of the deep instruments God used to shape her, Mother Marie de Gonzague, prioress of the Lisieux Carmel, and, for practical purposes, the mistress who oversaw Thérèse's formation as a novice. Marie de Gonzague was not a gentlewoman. She ran hot and cold within the same afternoon, capable of real tenderness toward the young nuns she favored, and capable in the next hour of a public correction sharp enough to leave a novice trembling before the whole community. Thérèse was not spared. She was reproved for clumsiness, for small failures in the exacting round of convent duties, sometimes in front of the other sisters, in a manner calculated less to teach than to test, and she loved this woman. Not at first with feeling. Feeling had very little to do with it, but with the deliberate daily choice of charity that would become in time the very grammar of the little way. She learned inside that relationship what she could not have learned from an easier superior, that love which depends on being loved back is not yet love in its fullness. Obedience to a temperament as changeable as Marie de Gonzag's became, for Thérèse, a school in trusting God's hand, even when the human hand delivering his will was unsteady. Later, when she came to write of hidden acts of love, performed for their own sake, and not for any answering warmth, she was drawing on ground broken here, in a novitiate under a prioress who did not always know how to be kind, and whom Thérèse chose, again and again, to love anyway. All of this, the bell, the poverty, the difficult superior, might have been formation enough for one young religious. But the year of her entrance into Carmel carried inside it a second crisis, one that ran alongside her novitiate like an undertow, and it came from outside the enclosure wall, from the house at Le Buissonnet, where her father still lived. There was, first, a last bright day. On January 10th, 1889, Thérèse received the habit, the ceremony called, in Carmelite custom, her clothing. It was a public triumph of sorts, the kind the family had waited years to see. Louis Martin, dressed in his finest, walked his youngest daughter into the chapel on his arm and presented her, as a father gives away a bride, to the altar and the enclosure beyond it. Those who were there remembered him standing tall and radiant that day. The king, his daughters had always called him with such affection, still every inch himself. It would be one of the last times anyone saw him whole. Within weeks the signs multiplied that something in him was failing, not his heart, which had always been generous to a fault, but his mind. He grew confused. He wandered from home and had to be found and brought back. The confusion was not gentle. It carried with it, at times, delusions that frightened the family more than they could easily say aloud in a small town where everyone knew the Martins and everyone, soon enough, knew what had happened to their father. In February of 1889, he was taken to the asylum of Bonsauveur in Caen, a hospital for the mentally afflicted, and there he would remain, with only occasional respite, for close to 3 years. For a family as proud of their father's dignity as the Martins had always been, this was not simply grief. It was public humiliation, born in a town too small to keep such things quiet, and it fell hardest on Céline, left at home to manage what remained of the household, and on the aunt and uncle the Guérens, who took up so much of the burden the daughters in Carmel could not carry themselves. And here the enclosure wall, which had seemed to Thérèse a gate into everything she desired, became something harder to bear, a wall she could not cross even to nurse her own father in his suffering. Outside, in the world, a daughter can sit beside a sick bed, can hold a trembling hand, can be simply present. Inside Carmel, Thérèse could do none of these things. She could only pray, and offer, and carry the knowledge of what was happening to the man she loved most in the world through the ordinary hours of an ordinary convent day, through chapter, through manual labor, through the recitation of the office, with no outlet for the grief but the silence itself. This, more than any imagined austerity, was the true discipline of hidden life, to suffer and be unable to act, to love and be able only to offer. She did not resent it, or if she did not let the resentment win. She came, in time, to see her father's trial as something the family had been given to carry together, rather than something inflicted on them alone. A chalice, she would later write, that they all drank from, each in a different room, each unable to ease the other's portion of it. She spoke of her father in these years, not with the language of shame the town might have used, but with something closer to reverence, as though the very depth of his humiliation, borne without complaint, made him more, rather than less, the man his daughters had always known, the king reduced, in the world's eyes, to the poorest of the poor, and drawn thereby, in ways only the eyes of faith could see, closer to the Christ he had always tried to serve. The crisis touched even her own approach to profession. Thérèse had entered Carmel, intending, as her sisters had, to make her vows as soon as canonically possible, and she had hoped for an early date. Instead, her profession was delayed by many months, the ecclesiastical superior overseeing the Carmel, weary of youthful fervor and mindful of the upheaval in her family, judged that more time and testing were needed before her vows could be received. For a young woman whose entire life since childhood had been a lesson in wanting things with her whole heart and being made to wait for them, this postponement was its own small martyrdom. She had waited for permission to enter Carmel early. Now she waited again, this time inside the walls she had already won, for the day she could finally, formally, become what she had come there to be. That day came at last on September 8, 1890, the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a day Thérèse would always treasure precisely because it placed her final vows under Our Lady's own birthday, as though Mary herself had reserved the morning for her. In the chapel, Sister Mary of the Trinity was 20 when she came to Thérèse in tears, certain she had ruined everything with a single unkind word spoken in the workroom. She expected correction. She received instead a question. Had she asked pardon of the sister she had wounded, and had she thanked God for showing her, yet again, how much she needed him? The tears did not stop at once. But something in the novice settled, because she had come looking for a superior's verdict and found instead a companion who seemed to already know the shape of her particular weakness, and loved her anyway, in it, through it, without waiting for it to be fixed first. This was the work Thérèse did for 4 years without a title that matched it. In 1893, when Mother Agnes of Jesus, her sister Pauline, was elected prioress, the office of novice mistress went formally to Mother Mary de Gonzague, as custom and the community's politics required. But Mother Mary de Gonzague, whatever her limitations, was not blind to what she had in her house, a 20-year-old Carmelite, whom the younger sisters had already begun unbidden to seek out. So she asked Thérèse to help her, unofficially, quietly. The kind of arrangement that leaves no line in a chronicle but shapes, in fact, everything that happens in the hours between offices, in the corners of the cloister where young souls come undone and need someone steady to come undone in front of. Thérèse was 20 years old, guiding women, some of them older than herself, one of them Sister Martha of Jesus, nearly her own age, but formed by a harder, more anxious temperament that needed something Thérèse alone seemed able to supply. She had by this point no title, no formation course, no manual. She had 8 years inside the walls, a childhood spent watching her father and her sisters, and a growing, still-forming conviction that God asks nothing of a soul beyond what that soul can give from where it stands. That conviction, tested now against real people with real wounds, is where the little way stopped being a private consolation and became something she could hand to another. She never pretended the work was easy, and she never pretended she was naturally suited to it. In one of her most disarming admissions, recorded in Story of a Soul, she confesses plainly that she was not by nature especially gentle or especially patient, and that whatever sweetness the novices found in her had to be asked for, each day, as a grace rather than assumed as a temperament. This is not false modesty. It is, if anything, the most important thing she tells us about how she taught. She did not draw on some inexhaustible reservoir of natural warmth. She drew on Christ, deliberately, repeatedly, the way a person draws water from a well they do not own, but have been given the key to. When a difficult novice tried her patience, and more than one did, she tells us she would sometimes recite the Our Father silently while the sister spoke, not to endure her, but to love her, because she understood that the love required of her exceeded what nature alone could produce. There is a particular honesty in her method that startles readers who come to her expecting only softness. She corrected faults directly. She did not confuse gentleness with permissiveness, and she seems to have understood, with an instinct sharper than her age should have allowed, that false comfort is itself a kind of cruelty, because it leaves a soul unprepared for the truth about itself. Sister Marie of the Trinity later remembered that Thérèse's corrections stung precisely because they were accurate, and that this accuracy, delivered without contempt, did something a vaguer kindness never could. It made the novice trust that when Thérèse did offer comfort, the comfort was as true as the correction had been. What she gave them, above all, was permission to be small and imperfect, and still be loved, still be useful, still be moving somewhere. She had lived this permission first for herself. Now she extended it, novice by novice, as though the little way were a garment she had sewn to fit her own soul, and discovered, to her surprise, fit others as well. To a novice paralyzed by scruples, she would say that God does not need our perfection, only our trust, that a mother does not love her child less for stumbling, but scoops the child up all the faster. To a novice discouraged by her own aridity in prayer, unable to feel anything when she knelt in choir, Thérèse would insist that feeling nothing is not the same as giving nothing, and that the driest prayer, offered anyway, out of pure will, might be worth more in God's eyes than the sweetest consolation, because it costs more. She was especially attentive to the ones who arrived at Carmel already bruised, women who had been told by families or by their own hard consciences that they were failures, that holiness was for stronger souls than theirs. To these she gave the deepest part of what she had discovered, that God's mercy runs downhill, seeking the lowest, emptiest vessels first, not because he is careless with excellence, but because he delights, particularly, in showing what he can do with nothing. She had tested this on herself in the years after her first communion and in the long, slow climb out of her childhood scrupulosity. Now she tested it on others, in real time, in the particular crises of particular young women whose names, Mary of the Trinity, Thérèse of St. Augustine, Martha of Jesus, history has kept precisely because she loved them so specifically, and not as an abstract flock. It is worth pausing on how strange this arrangement was, judged by any ordinary standard of religious formation. A novice mistress typically brings years of experience, a certain seasoned authority, the visible weight of having lived the vows longer than anyone she instructs. Thérèse had none of that scaffolding. She had entered at 15. She was barely into her 20s when this work fell to her. And yet the sisters she formed did not describe her as young for the role. They described her as exactly right for it, because what she offered was not the authority of long experience, but something rarer, an unclouded clarity about what love actually requires, undistorted by decades of compromise or fatigue. She saw straight through to the heart of a soul's difficulty, and she said what she saw, gently but without evasion, because she had already learned on herself, in the merciless mirror of her own girlhood, that evasion helps no one. This same clarity, offered inside the cloister to women she saw daily, was about to be asked of her again in a form that must have startled even her, by letter, to men she would never meet, on the other side of the world. In October of 1895, a young seminarian named Maurice Bellière wrote to the Carmelite of Lisieux with an unusual request. He was preparing for the missions, bound eventually for Africa, and he wanted what many missionary priests sought from contemplative communities, a sister who would pray for him specifically, who would be, in the language of the day, his spiritual sister, carrying him in prayer through whatever trials his vocation would bring. Mother Agnes, as prioress, gave the letter to Thérèse. It is not hard to imagine why. She was, after all, already doing this quiet work for the young women inside the walls. Why not extend the same attentiveness outward, toward a soul she would know only through paper and ink? She accepted the charge, and she took it with a seriousness that shows again how little she distinguished between the small work of the Enclosure and the larger work of the church beyond it. To Bellière she wrote as she wrote to her novices, directly, tenderly, without spiritual jargon, always returning the conversation to trust rather than achievement. He confessed to her his fears about his own unworthiness, his sense that his past failings disqualified him from the great sanctity a missionary vocation seemed to demand. She answered him the way she had answered frightened novices in the workroom, that Jesus does not need great deeds, only great love, and that a soul aware of its own weakness is in a far better position to receive mercy than a soul convinced of its own strength. She was not flattering him. She was handing him plainly the same key she had used on herself for a decade, that smallness, honestly admitted, is not a barrier to holiness, but very often its doorway. A few months later, in the spring of 1896, a second priest was given into her care, Father Adolphe Ruland, already ordained, already bound for the missions in China, where he would in fact spend the rest of his priestly life. Where her letters to Bellière carry a certain protective tenderness, he was younger, more anxious, more in need of steadying. Her letters to Ruland show her meeting a peer, a man already formed in his vocation, and she rises to it. She tells him, with striking confidence for a 23-year-old cloistered nun writing to an ordained missionary, that she considers her own vocation within Carmel to be, in its own hidden way, as apostolic as his in the open field of China, that her prayers and sacrifices are bound up with his preaching and his converts in a single economy of grace, invisible but real, the way roots are bound to the branch that bears the visible fruit. This is not a small claim, and she does not make it timidly. She had come by this point in her life to a settled conviction, one that would later stand at the very center of Story of a Soul, that the contemplative life is not a retreat from the Church's mission but its hidden engine. She uses in these letters and in her own writings from the same period the image of the Church as a body. If the whole body were an eye or a foot, where would be the heart, and who would love? She had come to believe that Carmel supplied precisely this, the hidden heart, unseen, unglamorous, without which the visible limbs of preaching and teaching and converting would have no life in them at all. To Ruland, sailing toward China, she was not merely a well-wisher praying vaguely for his safety. She understood herself, and told him so, to be bound to his mission as intimately as if she stood beside him in it. What is remarkable, reading these letters now, is how little distance she preserved between the guidance she gave inside the cloister and the guidance she gave across oceans. The same voice speaks to the frightened young novice and the resolute missionary priest. Trust more than you strive. Let God's mercy do what your own effort cannot. Smallness is not the obstacle to sanctity. It is very often the material out of which sanctity is made. She did not have two doctrines, one for women learning to pray and one for men risking martyrdom. She had one, tested first on herself, then on the novices at her elbow, then extended, with the same plainness, the same refusal of pious inflation, to priests she would never see face to face. It is tempting to imagine this correspondence as a burden gladly borne, and in one sense it was, but it cost her something real, and she does not disguise the cost. By the time her letters to Ruland and Bellière deepen in 1896 and into 1897, her health had already begun its decline, and the interior trial she would later call her trial of faith had already begun to press on her, though she kept most of its weight hidden even from these two men she guided so carefully. She wrote to them from inside a darkness she rarely named directly, offering light she was, by then struggling herself to see. This is perhaps the deepest proof that the little way was never a philosophy she constructed at a comfortable distance and then applied to others. She was living it, entering it more completely, precisely in the act of teaching it. Each letter to a missionary, each conversation with a frightened novice, another occasion to practice the same absolute trust she was urging on them, often before she had fully secured it in herself. None of this, not the quiet work with the novices, not the letters crossing the ocean to China and toward Africa, required her to leave the enclosure even once. She never stood in a pulpit. She never addressed an assembly. She corrected a young sister's fault in a convent corridor and steadied a missionary's conscience from her cell, using the same pen, very often on the same afternoon, and she seems never to have felt any contradiction in this, because she had already come to understand, with a clarity the rest of the Church would only later fully receive, that the wall around Carmel was not a wall against the world's need, but a kind of lens, concentrating her small hidden love until it could travel farther than her feet ever could. By the time these labors, the novices at her side, the priests at the far edge of her prayer, had settled into the daily rhythm of her last years in Carmel, she had already begun the work that would carry all of it forward, long after her own voice fell silent, setting down, at her sister's insistence and under obedience, the story of how she had come to see any of this at all. The statue stood where it had always stood, in the corner of the choir, where the community gathered for the divine office, and Thérèse had loved it since she was a girl of 10, lying fevered in her father's house, watching it turn its face toward her and smile until the sickness broke and she rose whole. Now she was 22, a professed nun of 5 years, and on the 9th of June, 1895, the feast of the Most Holy Trinity, she knelt before that same Blessed Virgin, this time inside the enclosure she had begged so hard to enter, with her sister Céline kneeling beside her. In her hand she held a piece of paper she had written herself, and on it were words she had been carrying inside her for longer than the ink had existed. She called it her act of oblation to merciful love. It is worth sitting with that name a moment, because everything in it is deliberate. Not an act of penance to a wrathful judge, not an act of expiation offered to appease a God counting faults, an oblation, an offering, entire and without reservation, to love itself, and to love precisely in its mercy. To understand why she wrote it, you have to know what had been troubling her that spring. She had heard sermons, read pious literature, absorbed a strain of French Catholic piety in her century that leaned hard on divine justice, souls who offered themselves as victims to that justice, accepting in advance whatever chastisement their sins or the sins of others might deserve. It was not a foolish devotion. Many holy people practiced it and were made holier by it. But something in Thérèse recoiled, gently and honestly, from picturing herself that way. Justice frightened her a little, and she was suspicious of any spirituality, even a rigorous one, that made a soul flinch from God rather than run to him. She had spent her whole life learning to run to him. She was not going to stop now for the sake of looking more serious. So she turned the whole logic over, the way she so often did, and found underneath it something that felt truer to what she had actually experienced of God. If justice was one of his attributes, so was mercy, and mercy, she reasoned, was in a sense the greater of the two, because justice can only give a soul what it deserves, while mercy can give it infinitely more. And if God's mercy was as vast as his justice, then surely mercy too needed victims, souls willing to be consumed not by punishment but by tenderness, offering themselves up entirely to that overflowing, uncontainable love, rather than holding any part of themselves back from it. She did not want to be spared God's fire, she wanted to be fuel for it. The words she set down that Trinity Sunday are not complicated theology. They are the plain speech of someone utterly in love, trying to say so honestly. She asked God to purify her at every moment, to consume her incessantly, letting the waves of infinite tenderness shut up within him overflow into her soul, so that she might become, in her own phrase, a martyr of his love. She wanted, she wrote, to renew this offering at every beat of her heart, an infinite number of times, until the shadows had vanished, and she could tell him of her love, face to face, in eternity, forever. Read it once and it sounds like devotional excess, the kind of thing a fervent young nun might write and later be embarrassed by. Read it again slowly, with what you already know of her, the child who could not bear being loved less than perfectly, the girl who climbed the stairs of Carmel, 2 at a time, because she could not wait one day longer to belong entirely to God, the novice who had just spent years learning, plank by plank, exactly how small and how loved she was. And it stopped sounding like excess. It sounds like the truest sentence she had ever written. She was not asking for anything strange. She was asking for what she had always wanted, spelled out at last in its final form, to disappear into love so completely that only love remained visible. She and Céline made the offering together that morning, 2 sisters side by side, before the Virgin who had once smiled a child back to health, and afterward Thérèse folded the paper and carried it, literally, next to her heart, tucked inside the little book of the Gospels she wore pinned to her habit. She would write to her older sister Marie of the Sacred Heart not long after, urging her too toward the same act, the same surrender, as though she could not bear to hold such a gift without handing pieces of it to everyone she loved. That was always her way. Whatever she found, she gave away before she had finished unwrapping it herself. An offering like that does not sit quietly on a shelf. She must have known, on some level, what she was asking for. To ask God to consume you incessantly is to ask, in effect, to be burned, and fire, however merciful, is still fire. Less than a year later, the answer came, and it came in the most physical way an answer to a spiritual prayer can come. In blood, on a Thursday night, in the dark. It was Holy Thursday, the night between the 2nd and 3rd of April, 1896. The community had kept the traditional watch, the holy hour, before the altar of repose, remembering Christ's agony in the garden, and the disciples who could not stay awake with him 1 hour. Thérèse had kept the watch too, and afterward returned, as every sister did, to her narrow cell to sleep the little that remained of the night before the long liturgies of Good Friday began. She had scarcely lain down when she felt something rise in her throat, a warmth she did not recognize. She thought at first only that she ought to see what it was, and so, rather than wake anyone in the middle of the great silence, rather than make a fuss over what might be nothing, she waited. If it was blood, she reasoned with a calm that still astonishes anyone who reads the account. The coming daylight would show her clearly enough. There was no need to trouble the house at that hour, for a fear that might prove foolish. So she lay in the dark, with the taste of it still on her lips, and waited for morning the way she had waited, all her short life, for every gift God had ever measured out to her in his own time, rather than hers. When the light came, she looked, and there it was, her handkerchief soaked through, unmistakable, red against the white cotton in the grey dawn. And what she felt, by her own account afterward, was not the fear you might expect from a 23-year-old woman discovering the first sign of the illness that would kill her. What she felt was joy, a quiet, astonished joy, and beneath it a conviction she could not have argued herself out of even if she had wanted to, which was that Jesus, on the very night he had kept his own agonized watch, had chosen this night to answer her. She had told him less than a year before that she wanted to be consumed. Here, in the dark, on the anniversary of his passion, was the first spark of the fire she had asked for. She told no one that morning. She rose, as every other sister rose, and went about the ordinary business of Good Friday in a Carmel that had no idea one of its youngest professed nuns had spent the night discovering she was dying. It was only later, when the symptom recurred and could not be hidden or explained away, that she went to her prioress. By then her own sister, Mother Agnes, had finished her term, and Mother Marie de Gonzague had returned to office, and told her what had happened, matter-of-factly, the way she told everything, without drama and without self-pity. The doctors were consulted eventually. Consumption, they said, tuberculosis, the disease that had already taken so many in that century, the disease that had likely been working in her lungs for longer than anyone had noticed, disguised by her youth and her quiet way of never complaining. But Thérèse had known, before any doctor confirmed it, what that first stain on the pillow meant. She did not need a diagnosis to recognize an answered prayer. It is worth pausing here, because this is one of those places in her story where two things that look unrelated turn out to be the same thing seen from two different angles. On one side, a young nun, kneeling before a statue, writing out by hand her desire to be consumed by love, and asking God to make it so. On the other, a body beginning, silently, to fail, the ordinary and terrible mechanism of a disease with a Latin name, spreading cell by cell through lung tissue with no more regard for her holiness than for anyone else's. It would be easy to keep those two things separate, to say that one was a spiritual disposition and the other a medical fact, and that connecting them is only pious sentiment laid over biology. Thérèse herself never made that separation, and neither should we, because she is our best witness to what actually happened inside her own soul that holy Thursday night. She did not experience the blood as an unrelated tragedy that happened to interrupt a spiritual high point. She experienced it as the same gift continuing, the oblation received, the offering accepted, the fire she had invited beginning, at last visibly to burn. This is, I think, one of the hardest and most important things her life has to teach a reader who has not yet suffered very much. We tend to imagine holiness as something that ought to be rewarded with ease, that if a soul finally manages to say yes to God completely, surely what follows should be light, consolation, some visible sign of favor. Thérèse's Carmel did not work that way, and neither, in the end, does anyone's life. The full surrender of June 1895 and the first hemorrhage of April 1896 were separated by less than a year, and she never once suggested it was a coincidence that the century's cruelest disease came knocking so soon after she had flung every door in her soul wide open. She had asked to be a victim of love. Tuberculosis was not a punishment for that prayer. It was, in her understanding, the form the answer took, the shape mercy chose to arrive in a fallen physical world where even the tenderest gifts of God still have to pass through flesh and blood to reach us. There is something almost unbearably intimate about the fact that she kept the discovery to herself that first morning. Picture her, 23 years old, alone in a narrow cell with a stained handkerchief, having just learned in the dark what her body was beginning to do to her. And her first instinct is not to run for help, but to sit with it, quietly, as though it were a letter from someone she loved that she wanted to read once, alone, before showing it to anyone else. That is not stoicism for its own sake. That is a woman who had spent years training her whole self to receive whatever God sent as a gift first and a hardship only second, and who was not about to abandon that training on the one morning it would be tested hardest. She would live 18 more months after that Holy Thursday, months that would ask more of her than perhaps any other stretch of her short life, months we have not yet come to, and should not rush toward, because they deserve to be met on their own ground rather than glimpsed ahead of time. But it began here, in this quiet convergence, an offering made freely in June, in the sunlight, before a statue that had once smiled on her as a child, and a price beginning to be paid in April in the dark, alone, with nothing but a stained handkerchief and a strange, stubborn joy. She had told God she wanted to be consumed. He had, in his own time and in his own way, begun. What strikes me most, coming back to this scene again and again over the years, is how little self-pity there is in it anywhere, not in the writing of the oblation, which asks for everything and holds nothing back, and not in the discovery of the blood, which she meets with something closer to recognition than dread. She had asked a serious question of God, "Do you want me entirely, or only in part?" And here, in the dark of an April night, she received her answer, written in her own blood on white linen. Most of us would call that a terrible way to be answered. Thérèse, without ever denying the fear that must have brushed past her too, chose instead to call it what she believed it truly was, the first sign of a bridegroom keeping his word to a soul who had asked, quite literally, to be entirely his. The blood came on the night between Holy Thursday and Good Friday, in the spring of 1896. Thérèse had gone up to her cell after the long offices of the Triduum, and she was already in bed when the cough took her, a small, ordinary cough at first, the kind that comes and goes in a cold Norman spring. Then she tasted something warm and metallic in her mouth. She lit her lamp. She looked at her handkerchief, and it was red. She has told us herself what she felt in that moment, and it was not fear, it was joy, a quiet, private joy, the joy of a bride who hears, faint but unmistakable, the footstep of the bridegroom on the stair. She had been asking for years to be allowed to die young, to slip out of this world before her love for it could cool into something ordinary. Here, she believed, was the answer beginning to arrive. She put out the lamp and went back to sleep with the peace of a woman who has just been told a longed-for guest is finally near the door. She did not yet know that the door, once it opened, would not open onto light. Within days, that same terrible luminous Eastertide, something else descended on her, something she would spend the rest of her short life carrying in near silence, not tuberculosis. Something crueler than tuberculosis, because it went for the one thing she had never doubted, the plain, comfortable certainty that heaven was there, waiting, real, and hers. She called it, in the pages she left us, a thick wall, one that rose up all at once between her and the sky she had gazed at her whole life, without a second thought, the sky where she had always pictured her mother, and before long her own soul at rest. Now the wall shut it out entirely. She had grown up trusting heaven the way a child trusts that the sun will rise. Now, for a year and a half, the thought crept into her, cold, articulate, relentless, that perhaps there was no sun at all. Perhaps death simply ended things. Perhaps the whole architecture of faith she had built her 23 years upon was a story invented by frightened people to comfort themselves in the dark. This is not a mild trouble to confess even now, in a book written by someone who loves her. It is not a passing scruple, the kind pious biographies sometimes soften into a mere dryness in prayer. She used the vocabulary of unbelief itself. She wrote in words her sisters were astonished and a little frightened to read after her death, that the reasoning of the most hardened atheists had forced its way into her soul. She, who had spent her whole life certain, was made for a year and a half to sit at the same table as those who doubt everything, and to eat the same bitter bread. And here is the thing the Church has never stopped marveling at. She chose that table on purpose. She understood, with a clarity that itself seems a kind of miracle inside the darkness, that God was letting her feel in her own soul some small portion of what unbelievers feel every day of their lives, so that her prayers and her hidden sufferings could be joined to theirs, offered up on their behalf. She had asked in her act of oblation the year before to be consumed by merciful love. She had not specified the currency. Now she saw the bill arriving, and she signed for it. She wrote that she was willing to sit at what she called the table of sinners until God judged the meal finished, so that the sinners for whom she sat there might one day see the light she herself could no longer see. What is remarkable, what her sisters in Carmel did not fully grasp until they read her notebooks after her death, is that almost none of them knew. She kept the darkness the way she had kept every other cross, privately, cheerfully, behind a face that gave nothing away. The novices she was still guiding through those very months found her exactly as steady as ever, exactly as patient with their small miseries, exactly as quick to smile at a joke in recreation. Only Mother Agnes, her own sister Pauline, and later Mother Marie de Gonzague, heard anything of what was happening beneath that smile, and even they heard only fragments, offered almost reluctantly, as if Thérèse were ashamed to trouble them with a burden she considered entirely her own to carry. This is the same instinct we have already watched her practice for years, the instinct of the little way turned now toward the worst material it would ever be asked to work with. She had always insisted that holiness was not a matter of feeling close to God, but of choosing Him regardless of feeling. Now the feeling was gone entirely, stripped away down to the bare wood of the will, and she went on choosing anyway. She still rose for the night office. She still scrubbed the same floors, corrected the same novices, endured the same small frictions of community life, and did it all without the interior light that had made every one of those acts sweet to her before. The little way had always meant doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. Now it meant doing them with no felt love at all, only the decision to act as if the love were there, trusting that God would supply what her heart for the moment could not. It was into this darkness, astonishingly, that her greatest writing was born. The first of the 3 notebooks that would become Story of a Soul had actually been finished just weeks before the wall came down. Manuscript A, the one Mother Agnes, then serving as prioress, had asked her to set down, The Childhood at Les Buissonnets, The Roses of Alençon, The Grace of Christmas 1886, all of it written in the winter of 1895 into January 1896, in a school copybook Thérèse, filled during whatever stolen hour, recreation or duty allowed her. She had written it as an obedience, almost as a chore, never expecting anyone beyond her own small circle of sisters to read it. She could not have known, setting down her pencil on those last pages, how soon the ground beneath her would give way, or that the very manuscript she had just finished, full of sunlight, full of a child's untroubled trust, would become the record of a certainty she was about to lose. The second notebook came directly out of the darkness itself, and it is in some ways the most startling document she ever produced, because it is in this one, written not from a place of peace, but from inside the trial, that she arrives at the discovery this whole book is named for. It happened during her annual retreat in September of 1896. Her sister Mary, who had entered Carmel before her and taken the name Sister Mary of the Sacred Heart, asked Thérèse to write down for her, privately, what she had come to understand about her own vocation, not a formal manuscript, just a letter between sisters, written in the quiet of those retreat days. Thérèse took up her pencil in the depth of the trial, with the wall still standing between her and the sky, and there, on ordinary paper meant for one reader's eyes, she worked out the great insight that no theologian had quite spoken in exactly these terms before, that the Church is a body, as St. Paul says, with many members and many gifts, but that a body needs not only hands to act, and feet to walk, and a voice to speak, it needs a heart. And a heart does not perform visible deeds. A heart only loves, and by loving gives life to every other member. She had wanted to be a priest, a missionary, a martyr, a doctor of the church, preaching truth from a pulpit. She tells us she had wanted all the great vocations at once, and grieved that her small strength could hold none of them. And then, in that retreat, alone with her pencil, it broke open in her all at once, and she wrote the sentence that has since travelled further than any pulpit ever could, that she had found her vocation at last, and her vocation was love. Notice what this means. The woman who wrote that sentence had, at that very hour, no consoling sense of God's nearness to lean on. She wrote it into the wall, not past it. This is why the discovery carries the weight it does. It was not the fruit of light, but the fruit of fidelity practiced without light, the fruit of a soul that had decided love was true, whether or not it could be felt, whether or not the sky above the garden wall gave any sign that someone was listening. Manuscript B is short, a few pages only, but it is the hinge on which her whole teaching turns, and she wrote it while sitting, by her own account, at the table of unbelievers. The third notebook was the hardest of the three to write, because by the time she began it, in the early months of 1897, her body had entered its own trial alongside her soul's. The tuberculosis that had announced itself with that mouthful of blood the year before was advancing now in earnest. And this final manuscript, commanded not by Mother Agnes this time, but by Mother Marie de Gonzague, once again reigning as prioress, had to be composed in whatever scraps of strength illness left her. She wrote sitting up in bed some days, and on better days out in the garden, a board across her knees for a desk, stopping when the coughing overtook her, and picking the pencil back up when it passed. This manuscript carries none of the sunlit ease of the first. It is heavier, plainer, written by a woman who could feel her own death approaching from two directions at once, the failing lungs and the silent heaven, and who kept writing anyway, because obedience had asked it of her, and because she had come by then to understand that this labor too was simply one more small thing to be done with love, whether or not she lived to see anyone read it. She did not write manuscript C as a woman composing her legacy. She wrote it as a Carmelite, finishing an assignment before she ran out of time to finish it, which in the end she very nearly did. By July of 1897 she was too weak to hold the pencil for long stretches, and what remained of her testimony after that was gathered by Mother Agnes at her bedside in the form of remembered conversations, the sayings later collected as her last conversations. But the three notebooks themselves, Manuscript A, begun in the ease of obedience before the darkness fell, Manuscript B, born in the middle of the trial's worst hour, Manuscript C, completed in the failing body's last working months, were, by the time she set down her pencil for the final time, essentially whole. 3 copybooks, unpolished, unpublished, written for 3 different readers who had each asked for them for private reasons, none of them written with an eye toward the wider church that would one day read every word. It would fall to Mother Agnes, after her sister's death, to gather the 3 notebooks into a single narrative and send it out into the world under the title Story of a Soul, and what that book would go on to do, in convents and rectories and ordinary homes across every continent, belongs to the chapters still ahead of us. But it is worth pausing here, before we follow the book out of the cloister, to notice what these 3 notebooks are, taken together, as the record of one particular soul in one particular trial. They are not the writing of a woman untouched by doubt, dictating serene certainties from a place of comfort. They are the writing of a woman who lost, for 18 months, the very thing her whole life had been built on, and who kept working, kept serving, kept smiling at her novices, and kept writing steadily, faithfully, under obedience, straight through the middle of that loss. She never tells us the darkness lifted before she died. It did not. She entered the last months of her life, still unable to feel the heaven she had once taken utterly for granted, still sitting, by her own choice, at the table of those who cannot believe. What changed was not the darkness, but her hold on love inside it. She had discovered, in the very depth of the trial, that love does not depend on the feeling of love being present, that it can be chosen, offered, and lived even by a heart that has been handed nothing back. This is, perhaps, the deepest lesson the trial ever taught her, and the one she left most clearly in the pages of that third notebook, that the vocation she had found the year before, in the dark, at her sister's request, during a retreat with no consolation in it, love was not a vocation for sunlit souls only. It was a vocation sturdy enough to survive the total withdrawal of every feeling that usually makes love feel possible. That is the word she kept returning to across all three notebooks, the word toward which every page of Story of a Soul quietly bends, whether she is remembering her mother's death, or the theft of her snowball fort, or the night she watched the moon over the Norman fields, or the wall that would not let. The trenches of the Argonne in 1915 were no place for flowers. Mud swallowed men to the knee. Rats grew fat on what the war left behind. And yet soldiers carried her there, a small paper card with her photograph, a worn copy of Story of a Soul, tucked inside a coat pocket next to letters from home. Chaplains reported it from the front, young men who had never read a spiritual book in their lives, asking for the little saint, the one who promised roses. Some carried her image into the shelling, and came out unhurt, and said her name over the noise. Some did not come out at all, and were found afterward with her book still on them, pages soft from handling. She had died in 1897, a Carmelite nun no one outside a small convent in Normandy had ever heard of. Within 20 years she was in the pocket of a French infantryman crouched under artillery fire, and he believed, as thousands like him believed, that she was near. This is the part of her story that has no ending, because it has not stopped happening. It began, as so much of what matters in her life began, with paper and obedience. Mother Agnes of Jesus, Pauline, the sister who had once tucked Thérèse into bed and taught her the rosary bead by bead, sat down after Thérèse's death with 3 notebooks in her hands. They were not written as one continuous book. The first had been composed under Pauline's own obedience, a memoir of childhood meant for family eyes. The second, brief and luminous, had been written at Mother Mary de Gonzague's command, and addressed to God directly, the pages that hold the offering to merciful love. The third had been finished at Sister Mary de Gonzague's request in the final months, written in a hand growing weaker by the week, in a body that could no longer sit upright for long. 3 manuscripts, 3 different addressees, written across 9 years and under 3 different obediences. Pauline's task was to weave them into one book that a stranger could pick up and read as a single story. She did more than weave, she trimmed. Some of Thérèse's plainer turns of phrase were smoothed. A few family details were softened or removed, out of a sister's instinct to protect what was private, and to present a saint's life as the community understood a saint's life ought to look. Later generations of scholars, given access to the original manuscripts, would restore Thérèse's own words in full, the autograph pages photographed and published so that anyone could see exactly what she had written, unedited, in her own hand. But that correction came decades later, and it does nothing to diminish what Pauline accomplished in 1898. She took a Carmelite's private notebooks, written under obedience for the eyes of 2 or 3 people, and gave them to the world under the title Histoire d'une âme, Story of a Soul. 2,000 copies were printed for the first edition, sent quietly to other Carmels and to a handful of interested clergy. No one expected more than that. It did not stay quiet. Convents wrote back asking for more copies. Priests began reading passages from the pulpit. Within a few years, the book was being translated into English, German, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, and by the time the First World War came, it had gone through printings that ran into the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers were not an aberration. They were the flood finding its natural channel. Thérèse had promised in her last months that she would spend her heaven doing good on earth. The men in the trenches were among the first to test whether she meant it, and they came away convinced that she did. The roses came first as a phrase, and then as a fact, reported by name after name. A missionary in China wrote that a rose had appeared on his desk the morning he prayed a novena to her, in a house with no roses for 100 miles. A mother prayed for a sick child and found days later that a bouquet had been delivered to her door from a well-wisher who could not explain, upon questioning why she had chosen roses of all flowers, or why that particular week. These were not official miracles in the sense the Church requires for canonization, those would come later, examined with the exacting care Rome gives to every claim of the miraculous, but they were the ordinary undercurrent of her cult from the very beginning, small, unprovable, deeply felt, exactly the register in which Thérèse herself had always spoken of grace. She had never promised fireworks. She had promised a shower of roses, and the people who wrote to Lisieux by the thousand insisted that the shower had started and had not stopped. The Carmel at Lisieux, which had been a house of fewer than 30 hidden women, became a place of pilgrimage almost overnight. Letters arrived by the sackful, so many that the community had to appoint sisters specifically to answer them. Mother Agnes, now prioress, found herself administering not a quiet convent, but the epicenter of a devotion sweeping across a continent, still recovering from war. The Bishop of Bayeux, who had once barely known Thérèse existed, now opened the diocesan process for her cause. Rome, moving with a speed almost unheard of for causes that ordinarily take generations, beatified her in 1923, 26 years after her death, a blink of an eye by the Church's usual clock, and canonized her on May 17, 1925, in St. Peter's Basilica, before a crowd so large that Pope Pius XI, presiding, would later call her the greatest saint of modern times. He did not say it lightly, and he did not say it only once. Pius XI returned to that judgment across his pontificate, drawn back again and again to the strangeness of what she represented. A girl who had done nothing the world calls remarkable, who had lived and died behind an enclosure wall in a provincial French town, who had never preached, never founded an order, never left France, and who was now, within a single generation, one of the most beloved and most invoked saints in the Church's entire history. In 1927 he named her, alongside Francis Xavier, co-patroness of all missions and missionaries, an honor that stunned people who remembered, correctly, that she had never set foot outside her own country. But she had wanted nothing more in life than to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth, had begged her superiors and Rome itself to be sent to the Carmel in Hanoi, had written to missionary priests as spiritual brothers, and prayed for their labors, as though the souls they were winning were her own responsibility. The Church, in naming her patroness of missions, was not overriding her hidden life. It was recognizing what she had always insisted was true, that a Carmelite's prayer reaches as far as a missionary's feet, that hiddenness and apostolic fire are not opposites but two names for the same love. In 1944 she was named co-patroness of France itself, alongside Joan of Arc, an extraordinary pairing. The warrior maid who led armies and the cloistered girl who never left her convent, standing together as the twin faces of French sanctity, one the sword, one the rose. The story might have rested there, and it would already have been an astonishment. It did not rest there. Devotion is one kind of recognition. The Church has another, rarer honor still, reserved across 2,000 years for a small number of men and women whose writing is judged to carry not merely personal holiness, but a teaching that belongs to the whole body of Christ. This is the title Doctor of the Church, and it had been given, before 1997, to 32 saints: Augustine, Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross among them, nearly all of them scholars, bishops, theologians, trained in the great schools of Europe. Thérèse had no formal theological education. She left school at the ordinary age. A merchant's daughter left school in provincial Normandy. She read her Bible, her Imitation of Christ, the writings of John of the Cross that her sister smuggled to her in Carmel, and she wrote her own notebooks in a plain convent hand, in the idiom of a 19th century French girl, using images of dolls and elevators and staircases rather than the vocabulary of the schools. And on October 19, 1997, Pope John Paul II declared her a Doctor of the Church. He did not do it to soften the honor or make an exception for simplicity's sake. He did it because he had read her, closely and for years, and had come to believe, as had a growing chorus of bishops and theologians across the world, petitioning Rome for exactly this recognition, that the little way was not merely a lovely private piety, it was a coherent, complete, and startlingly deep doctrine of the spiritual life, one that answered the question the whole modern church was asking with fresh urgency, whether holiness was only for the exceptional, the ascetic, the mystically gifted, or whether it lay open to anyone, a nurse, a mother, a factory worker, a child who was willing to do the smallest thing with the greatest love and to trust God's mercy the way a child trusts a parent's arms. John Paul II called her teaching a science of love and said the church needed to hear it. She was only the third woman ever named a doctor, following Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena by mere years, two women who had themselves waited centuries after their deaths for the honor. Thérèse waited 100. In the arithmetic of the church, that is almost no time at all. In human terms, it meant that within a single century, a girl who died unknown at 24 had been placed, formally and permanently, among the great teachers of the Christian faith, not despite her smallness, but because of what her smallness had been able to see. Her relics have traveled since, in ways she could not have imagined, and would, one suspects, have found faintly embarrassing, she who spent her whole life trying to stay hidden. The reliquary containing bone fragments from her body has been carried in procession through more than 40 countries, Russia, where crowds waited in the cold for hours, the United States, where cathedrals opened their doors around the clock to accommodate the lines, prisons, where inmates who had never prayed a rosary in their lives knelt before the small wooden casket and wept without being able to say exactly why. In some countries, the crowds numbered in the hundreds of thousands over a single tour. Bishops who had expected modest turnout found their cathedrals overwhelmed, extra masses added, confession lines that ran for blocks. It is not an exaggeration to say that more people have stood in the physical presence of Thérèse of Lisieux's remains, seeking her intercession, than ever stood in the presence of her living body in the small convent at Lisieux where she spent her whole religious life unseen by the world. And beneath the great public moments, the canonization crowds, the papal declarations, the relic processions with their television cameras, there is the quieter, steadier stream that matters just as much, perhaps more, the ordinary person today who finds a rose in an unlikely place and thinks of her. A woman waiting on test results who prays a novena and finds, on the 9th day, a rose blooming out of season on a bush she thought had died. A father praying beside a hospital bed who steps outside for air and sees, incongruously, a single flower on the pavement where no flower ought to grow. These stories do not make headlines. They are not adjudicated by any tribunal in Rome. They circulate instead in the way that matters most for a devotion meant to reach the small and the overlooked, mother to daughter, friend to friend, one person's quiet gratitude becoming another person's quiet hope. Carmelite monasteries around the world still receive letters, as Lisieux did in 1898, thanking Thérèse for favors granted, asking her to intercede again, addressing her the way one addresses a friend rather than a distant figure in a stained glass window. She had asked in her last year not to be left to rest in heaven doing nothing. She had asked to keep working, to keep loving, to spend her eternity leaning down toward the earth she had left. The letters that keep arriving, more than a century later, are the record of a promise that has been kept without interruption. It is worth pausing on how strange this all is, because familiarity can make it feel inevitable, and it was never that. She was the youngest of a large family in a small city no one outside Normandy had reason to know. She entered a convent that most of her contemporaries would have called an obscure choice even by the standards of religious life, not a missionary order sending letters home from Asia, not a teaching congregation with schools and public works, but a cloistered contemplative house whose sisters were bound never to leave and rarely to be seen. She wrote her one book under obedience, for an audience of family and community, never once imagining a printing beyond the walls she lived behind. She died young, in physical agony, in spiritual darkness, so total that she confessed to her sisters she could no longer feel the faith she had spent her whole life defending. By every worldly measure available in the September of 1897, hers was a life that had accomplished almost nothing visible and would be forgotten within a generation, the way most such lives are forgotten. And yet here she is, doctor of the church, patroness of missions and of France, invoked by name in hospital rooms and army barracks and prison cells on every continent, her image carried by the same silent conviction that carried her book into the trenches of the Argonne. The shower of roses she promised on her deathbed has not thinned with the passing of 100 and more years. If anything, it has widened, reaching people and places she never saw and could not have named, doing precisely what she said it would do, falling gently on anyone small enough to hold out their hands and catch it. What remains, after the canonization crowds have gone home and the relic processions have moved to the next country, is the same offer she made from her convent bed in the last September of her life, that holiness is not a mountain to be climbed by the strong, but a gift held out to whoever is small enough to receive it. The Church has confirmed this in every honor it has given her, the sainthood, the doctorate, the patronages, but the confirmation was never really the point. The point was always the hand held out, and the roses falling into it, and the promise, kept now for well over a century, that she had not finished loving simply because she had stopped breathing. You have been holding a small life in your hands for 8 chapters now, and small is the right word, though by now you know it is not a small word. A girl who wanted to be a saint before she could tie her own shoes. A young woman who climbed over the enclosure wall's stone silence and found it was not a tomb but a garden. A Carmelite who wrote no treatises, gave no lectures, founded no order of her own, and who is at this hour one of only 4 women in 2,000 years to be named a doctor of the Church. A dying girl who could not feel God's hand and held it anyway, in the dark, because she had already decided that love does not require proof. Roses that have not stopped falling since the day she promised they would. That is the portrait. It is complete in the way a single photograph of someone you love is complete. You can see the whole face, the whole light in the eyes, and yet you know there is a lifetime standing behind that one instant, and you want it. You want the years the photograph cannot hold. You want to have been there, this is where I tell you, you still can be. Everything in these pages has been drawn from a fuller record, the letters Thérèse wrote to her sisters, and to missionary brothers she never met in this life, the recollections of the nuns who lived beside her in that small Norman cloister, and above everything else, Story of a Soul, the 3 notebooks she filled under obedience and never intended for the wide world, which her sister mother Agnes gathered and gave to the Church within a year of her death. I have shown you the shape of the house. I have not shown you every room. That was never the purpose of this small book, and I would be doing Thérèse a disservice if I let you believe otherwise. She deserves more than an introduction. She deserves the long, unhurried company that only a full life, told at full length, can offer. So before we part, and we are about to part, you and I, though not from her, let me tell you what waits, because 3 volumes are waiting for you, and each one holds something this book could only gesture toward. The first is called The Little Flower. You have already met the child in these pages, the little girl at Libya-Sonnet who wept when her father teased her, and could not stop weeping until someone understood why. The 4-year-old who lost her mother and, according to her own testimony, felt her whole personality change in that single loss, becoming timid and sensitive, where she had been sunny. The girl who watched her sister Pauline, then her sister Marie, then finally her beloved Céline, leave the family hearth for convent life, each departure tearing something loose in her until she began to understand that she too was being called, and called soon. But a child's face in a photograph is not the same as watching that child grow, day by ordinary day, into the young woman who would one day stand before a bishop and then before a pope himself, an old man in white, surrounded by cardinals in the Vatican, and ask at 14 years old to enter Carmel before the canonical age. The Little Flower gives you those years whole. It gives you the household in Alençon and then in Lisieux, the particular warmth of Louis and Zélie Martin's marriage, and the particular grief of Zélie's death from breast cancer when Thérèse was only 4. It gives you the long convalescence of what the family called her strange illness, and the moment-by-moment account, as close as any account can come, of what Thérèse herself named her Christmas conversion, the night at not yet 14, when something hardened and matured in her all at once, when the tears that had ruled her childhood simply stopped, and she found in herself a strength she had not earned an hour before. It gives you Pranzini, the convicted murderer for whose soul she prayed with the fierce, particular confidence of someone who has decided that no one is too far gone for mercy, and the newspaper account of his repentance at the very last moment, which she kept for the rest of her life as proof that God answers even a child's prayer when the prayer is bold enough. And it gives you the pilgrimage to Rome, the audience with Pope Leo XIII, the trembling girl on her knees before him breaking the silence she had been told to keep, because she had come too far and wanted too much to let politeness stop her now. If you have loved the child in this book, that volume is where she becomes a young woman standing at the threshold of her calling, and where you understand finally why Carmel could not wait for her to turn 21. The second volume is called Hidden in the Heart of the Church, and it takes you where this small book could only knock, behind the wall itself. I have told you about the grill, about silence, about the small offices Thérèse held without ever seeking recognition for them. Assistant to the novice mysteries, painter of small devotional cards, the sister the other nuns brought their difficulties to, because she never once made them feel foolish for having them. But a cloister is not a set of facts. It is 30 women living at close quarters for years on end, women with tempers and griefs and small vanities and real holiness all tangled together. And Thérèse lived among them, not as a saint set apart, but as a young nun doing her novitiate, learning obedience the hard way, under a prioress, her own sister Pauline, and later Mother Marie de Gonzague, whose demands were not always gentle, and whose favor was not always easy to win. Hidden in the Heart of the Church gives you those years in full, the daily horarium of prayer and labor and near total silence. The particular trial of Sister Thérèse's assignment to care for a difficult, demanding elderly nun named Sister Saint Pierre, whom she served at table each evening with a patience she had to manufacture fresh every single night, because it did not come naturally to her. The small crucifixions of community life that she came to call, without any bitterness at all, her daily bread. It gives you her father's final years, the strokes, the paralysis, the asylum at Cannes, where Louis Martin spent 3 years in a decline that broke his daughters' hearts, and that Thérèse accepted, publicly, as the cross her family had been given to carry together. And it gives you what this book named only in outline, the act of oblation to merciful love she made in June of 1895, offering herself as a victim to God's love rather than to his justice, a prayer so bold that she herself wondered afterward if she had gone too far, and the visitation that followed 9 months later on the night of Holy Thursday, blood on her handkerchief in the dark, the first sign of the tuberculosis that would take 18 months to finish its work. That volume walks with you through the whole architecture of the cross as she carried it, the slow suffocation of her lungs, the abandonment of every spiritual consolation she had once relied on, the terrible temptations against faith that assailed her in a soul that had never doubted, and the courage with which she kept teaching her novices and writing her manuscript, even as her body failed around her. If this book showed you that her final darkness was not defeat, that volume shows you exactly what defeat would have looked like, and how far she was from it, line by line, in a place most of us will never enter with our own eyes, but that she has left open to us now in ink. The third volume is called A Shower of Roses, and it is in a sense the volume most like the promise she made at the very end, that her heaven would be spent doing good on earth. I have given you the seed of the little way in these pages, the discovery, made in prayer over the words of Scripture that speak of little ones being lifted in the arms of God, that holiness was not a mountain to be scaled by heroic effort, but a lift to be received by anyone small enough to ask for it. I have shown you spiritual childhood in its first bloom. But Thérèse's doctrine did not stay a private discovery. She wrote it down, taught it to her novices in letters so clear and so unadorned that theologians have spent more than a century trying to say it better and failing, and A Shower of Roses is where that teaching stands complete. Her understanding of how the smallest act done with great love outweighs any grand gesture done without it. Her image of herself as a small ball tossed by the Christ child, content to be a plaything in his hands rather than an instrument of her own choosing. Her insistence, radical among the spiritual writers of her age, that we need not fear our own weakness, because weakness is precisely the door through which mercy prefers to enter. That volume follows the doctrine from her own notebooks into the wider church, into the hands of Pope Pius XI, who canonized her in 1925, only 28 years after her death, faster than almost any saint in the Church's memory. Into the hands of Pope John Paul II, who declared her a doctor of the Church in 1997, standing before the world to say that this uneducated young nun, who never left her convent walls, had something to teach the universal Church that the Church could not do without. And it follows the roses themselves, the graces reported by name, by date, by ordinary people all over the world, who asked her for a sign and received one, sometimes literally in the form of a rose petal appearing where no rose had any business appearing, and who came away from that small, strange mercy certain that the little flower had heard them and gone to work. That volume does not end with her death. It cannot, because her story has not ended. It is still being written in the graces she is asking of God for you this year, this week, possibly this very day if you have already whispered her name. I want to be honest with you about why these 3 books exist as 3 and not as one longer version of what you have just finished. It is not simply length for its own sake. Each volume has its own weather. The little flower is bright even in its griefs, because childhood, even wounded childhood, carries a kind of daylight that never entirely leaves it. Hidden in the heart of the Church grows darker and more interior as it goes, because the cloister asks you to sit still in rooms most of us spend our lives avoiding, real suffering, real doubt, real bodily decline, and it does not let you look away, because Thérèse herself did not look away, and A Shower of Roses opens back out into light, wide light, the light of a doctrine given to the whole Church, and a heaven that keeps sending flowers down. To read all 3 is to walk the same shape her own life walked. The trellis for the seed you're about to see grow, the crucible for the flower you've already glimpsed budding, the harvest for the flower you've watched hold on through the dark. This small book has given you the outline of all 3 seasons at once, compressed, because a first meeting should be whole, even when it is brief. But an outline is not the same as living inside the weather. You deserve the weather. She deserves to be known that way, slowly, patiently, the way you would come to know a friend, rather than summarized, the way you might describe a stranger. I think if she could speak to you directly at this threshold, and in a real sense she can, because you need only pick up her own words to hear her, I think she would tell you not to be intimidated by 3 volumes, when your whole prayer life at this moment might consist of 5 minutes stolen before bed. She was never intimidated by the sheer size of holiness, because she never believed size was the point. She told her own novices that she came to Carmel to save souls and to pray for priests, and that this immense purpose did not require an immense method. It required only that she do the small things in front of her with the whole of her heart. Read 1 page of The Little Flower tonight, if that is all you have. Read 1 letter from hidden in the heart of the Church on a hard day, when suffering feels less like a cross and more like an ambush, and let her show you that she felt that too, and did not stop trusting. Keep A Shower of Roses on your nightstand for the day you need proof that she is still working, still listening, still tossing roses down to whoever asks. She wrote, near the very end of her life, that her vocation was love, that within the heart of the Church, her mother, she would be love. That is not a sentiment she left folded inside a convent wall in Normandy in 1897. It is a vocation she has kept ever since, and it includes you, reading this sentence, wherever and whoever you are. The door behind the grille that once seemed so final, so enclosed, so shut against the world, that door has never really closed. She made sure of that herself, with a promise she is still keeping. Go on then, turn the page. She has been waiting for you longer than you know, and she is not in any hurry, because she has all of heaven, and she has decided to spend it on you. May the little flower pray for you, and may her little way become, in whatever small and ordinary way your life allows, your own.